how far does Israel go before the UK and US actually say enough is enough? The Israeli government is a rogue pariah state and should be seen as such by the world. They ought to be cutting all arms supplies to Israel at the moment until the Israeli government changes. What's happening with Starmer in the Labour Party is kind of Stalinist.
How's Israel able to get away with a genocide in Gaza and invading its neighbour Lebanon? Joining me to discuss this and more is former Home Office Minister Norman Baker. Great to have you with us.
Hello, Phil.
What's unique about this conflict that we're seeing?
I think what's unique about it is the fact that Israel is behaving as a rogue state, a pariah state, in a way that we've not seen before. The idea that it should withhold food and medicine from starving people in the Gaza Strip, that the settlers on the West Bank are completely out of control and just annexing land that's belonged to Palestinians for centuries, that the country is able to go and bomb Gaza Strip, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, almost anywhere it wants to. It's out of control, this state, Israel. And in the meantime, tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians have died. They're shooting at UN peacekeepers. I mean, this is just beyond anything which we've seen before.
Why do you think Israel's doing this? Why does Netanyahu feel like he can just get away with whatever he's doing?
We know that Netanyahu is facing domestic charges in the Israeli courts, which of course he's trying to smother and reduce in power. And so long as he's prime minister, he's protected. And he can only be prime minister as long as he gives in to the maniacs, the religious maniacs on the far right, the extreme right, who take their inspiration from the Old Testament and believe in Judea and Samaria and all that sort of stuff. And he has to keep them happy in order to stay in power, because otherwise he loses a majority in the Knesset. So that's one reason he's doing it. Second reason is that I'm afraid that there's an element of racism. I think that he and his government regarded Palestinians and Arabs generally as some sort of Untermensch. And I use that word advisedly. And you know, the Israeli government, above all others, really ought to be aware that treating some people as second-class citizens and somehow inferior to themselves is a lesson from history from the 1930s that perhaps they, above all, ought to have learned and be able to resist.
10 years ago, you were a Home Office Minister in David Cameron's coalition government, and Israel was once again at war in Gaza. But that time, it only took about a month before the British government announced a partial arms embargo. This time, it took almost a year and a change of government before we saw that. Why do you think this pro-Israel stance in Westminster has become so much more deeply ingrained over the last decade?
The Israeli government has been very busy at trying to infiltrate each of the political parties to make sure that they are identifying friends in those parties who will then stand up for Israel, Caesar or Israeli government, and stymie any opposition which is there. We saw people who criticise Israel in Parliament being criticised heavily in return by their party leadership, sometimes expelled from their party. I mean, you know, if an MP can't stand up and say what he thinks or she thinks in the House of Commons, you know, what kind of democracy is that? You know, we need to be more tolerant of people in political parties. I'm happy to say Lib Dems are more tolerant, actually. We do allow people to say a bit more what they think. But I mean, you know, what's happening with Starmer in the Labour Party is kind of Stalinist. Anyone who goes out of line is basically have the whip withdrawn, or particularly on this sorts of areas. So the Israeli government has been very, very effective at kind of corralling the political parties to shut up people who might be saying something that they don't like.
Of course, Netanyahu says what the Israeli military is doing in Gaza is justified because of the Hamas atrocities of October 7th, in which over 1,000 Israelis were killed and hundreds taken hostage. But do you feel that can really justify the amount of devastation and deaths that we've seen over the last year in Gaza?
The events of October 7th last year were outrageous in their own right and disgraceful and unjustifiable, because innocent Israeli citizens were killed and others were taken hostage and still are being held hostage. But it doesn't give them carte blanche to bomb everything in sight, to reduce the Gaza Strip to rubble, and to kill tens of thousands of innocent people who have nothing to do with this particular incident on October the 7th.
Why is the West still supporting Israel, which you've just described as a rogue state? And particularly when it's led by Netanyahu, who seems to pursue such a military approach to everything, including the hostages, when in fact military raids into Gaza have released just a handful of hostages. The vast majority were freed through that temporary truce that we saw with Hamas in November last year. Why are they still going along with this?
I don't think Netanyahu's interested in releasing hostages particularly. I don't think that's high on his list of priorities. If it had been, they'd have been released by now. He'd have come to a deal, a ceasefire or some sort of arrangement, which after all, the West was, in theory anyway, trying to broker. And certainly countries, the Arab countries around, would have helped with that process. So there's no question that that could have been achieved. And he was responsible, in my view, for the Israeli hostages not being released. Of course, those who are holding them also have responsibility, but he could have got them out had he chosen to do so, and he hasn't. And what's happened is the UK and US have been so tied into Israel, both historically, but also through defence arrangements, which we don't necessarily know the details of, but are there, secret defence arrangements, that they feel obliged to support this country. They're also, of course, worried about their own domestic audiences in the US and the UK. And Netanyahu and his government have been very effective at brandishing the weapon to say that anyone who criticises the Israeli government is anti-Semite or anti-Israel. We're not. I mean, I criticise the British government quite a lot. I'm not anti-British. I criticise the American government. I'm not anti-American. I'm criticising the Israeli government. I'm not anti-Israel. So, we shouldn't be bludgeoned into being quiet because of that allegation, that false allegation from Netanyahu, which equates criticism of his government with some sort of anti-Jewish position. It's not the same thing at all. There are many Jews in this country, in the UK, who of course have been out in the demonstrations to protest against Netanyahu. There are many Jews in America who are protesting against Netanyahu. It is not a Jewish thing. It's about the behaviour of the Israeli government, which is entirely separate to that. The question has to be asked, how far does Israel go before the UK and US actually say enough is enough? What we've had is a lot of wrist slapping from President Biden to say you mustn't do that. And Netanyahu just carried on and does what he wants anyway. And the US, while it says you must look after the citizens of the West Bank and you must look after those in the Gaza Strip, in the meantime, they're supplying them with huge amounts of armaments, which they don't actually probably need to deal with states around them who aren't armed in the same way at all. How long are they going to put up with this before they actually do something sensible to say enough is enough? And in my view, they ought to be cutting all arms supplies to Israel at the moment until the Israeli government changes and behaves in a more responsible and humane way.
The Labour government would say that it is taking action, and last month it suspended around 30 arms export licences to Israel. Campaigners say that didn't include licences for the F-35, which is Israel's most advanced fighter jet. 15% of it is made in Britain, and Israel is using that to bomb not just Gaza, but also Lebanon and Yemen. Do you feel that Labour hasn't gone far enough on stopping arms sales to Israel?
Well, the Labour Party's, Labour government's arms embargo is welcome in the sense that it recognises that there's a link between Israeli government behaviour and supply of arms to the country. So that's a welcome step. But the reality is, I'm afraid, that this is being driven by cynical domestic calculations, as many things are. Let's not forget that at the last election, the Labour Party did very well, but it lost support quite seriously in areas where there was a Muslim population, and we've now got an independent bloc of MPs in Parliament which have taken seats from Labour. So they're looking over their shoulder at their own vote base, and I think that's why they've responded in that particular way. But, I think there are honourable politicians in the Labour Party and in the Lib Dems, and even some in the Tories, who are appalled by what Israel is doing. And it's time they stood up and said so.
During your time as a Liberal Democrat MP, you were known as a thorn in the side of the secret state, shedding light on MI5 and MPs' expenses, but much of Whitehall secrecy has survived, particularly at the Ministry of Defence, which is being very coy about how it's helping Israel currently. We know this includes things like surveillance flights over Gaza, which are being run out of the British base on Cyprus. That base is also being used by the US as a launchpad for special forces and logistics flights into Israel. And when Declassified and a handful of MPs have asked very basic questions about that, they've been met with a wall of evasiveness. Do you feel that official secrecy can be justified when we're talking about the UK military's involvement with a country accused of genocide?
Well, look, we've got a long way from Robin Cook's ethical foreign policy have we not? Which is now, I struggle to find anything very much ethical about the present foreign policy of this government, or indeed the last one. Of course, we need to operate to some extent with information not provided to the public, and some of the stuff MI5 and MI6 does is actually quite right, I think, and I saw that from my time at the Home Office. But there's a line drawn in the right place between the necessary secrecy we have to have and the right of the individual and the country at large to be able to find out what's being done in our name. And I don't think the line is drawn in the right place. And I think some of the things you've referred to in terms of secret flights and so on, we should know about those. Why shouldn't we know about those? That's been done in our name. There's no particular secret requirement to hold that away from the British public. Let's find out more about these things. So the answer is, yes, we do need some secrecy, and we do need that, but we don't need as much as we've got at the moment.
If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click the button below. If you want to help Declassified make more videos like this, you can donate to our work through the Super Thanks button or by going to our website and joining us from £3 a month. Thanks for watching.